Welcome to Curious Campus, where we talk to professors from various departments at the University of Toronto about a recent research topic they've dived into, breaking down these new developments for everyone to understand. Stay tuned, you'll definitely learn something new. I'm Chubby, and today I'm here with Professor Shawna, and we're going to talk about her research in her paper, Beyond Sea, Sun and Fun, Exploring the Viability of Jamaican Creole Heritage Language Education in Toronto. Shawna-Kaye Tucker is an assistant professor within the Department of Curriculum, Teaching and Learning at the Ontario Institute for Studies and Education here at the University of Toronto. She's interested in the development of oral language and literacy skills among learners with English as an additional language. As a Caribbean native, she has a keen interest in language and literacy development of children in Creole-speaking contexts, as well as in the role of home and community literacy practices in learner outcomes. Today, we're here to discuss her paper, Beyond Sea, Sun and Fun, Exploring the Viability of Jamaican Creole Heritage Language Education in Toronto, to understand the challenges and understanding that exist for Jamaican Creole, or JamC, in heritage language education. And without further ado, Shawna, welcome to Curious Campus.
Thank you. It's really nice to be here with you.
First, I was very curious about the title of it. What does Beyond Sea, Sun and Fun mean in the title of your paper?
Yeah, I really like the title of this paper because I think it gets at the heart of what my research agenda in this area is about. That when we think of the Caribbean, we think the sea, sun, tourism, going on a holiday. And as a result, or related to that, the Caribbean, especially in applied linguistics, which is where my research takes place, is very highly underrepresented in language and literacy education research, largely because we have this idea of the Caribbean as sea, sun, and fun, but not necessarily looking at the languages as something worth studying or something that can be studied systematically, and the fact that these are languages. I think lots of people have the idea of them as broken versions of something else, whether it's broken versions of English or French. And so this topic is really trying to get at the heart of that these are viable linguistic entities that are worth studying, that are worth exploring.
Yeah, that is really cool. And to talk about that specifically, like in Toronto, where we do have a large population of Jamaican immigrant population, but despite this, it's been difficult to promote community-based systems to educate future generations about the language. So why has that been difficult instead of being like an ease in communities to just promote their own language?
For various reasons. Actually, there's systematic reasons, but there are also cultural and attitudinal and language ideology reasons. So I think in Toronto, generally, when you talk about heritage language programs, or in Ontario, a lot of the funding is kind of decided by the government. And so you can see kind of where we decide to invest our money, what we think is worthwhile. And so Dr. Jeff Bale, who also is at OEC, does a lot of work into heritage language provisions in Canada. And in his 2020 research paper, one of the things he found was, especially as it relates to Caribbean natives, funding is not allocated there because of the precarious positioning of this group, where they're identified as speaking one of the official languages of Canada. But at the same time, I think they're labeled as culturally unique. And this is kind of the reasoning given to not necessarily directing much funding in that. So structurally, on that level, we see issues there. But also within the community, Creole languages, generally the research shows that at best, the language attitudes tend to be quite ambivalent in terms of formal language learning. And so within the community, there are issues with people seeing the Creole as not being instrumental, or the Creole as hindering, especially as an immigrant, hindering your child from kind of upward social and economic mobility. So there are a lot of these things intersecting to kind of impact their experiences of immigrants as of, say, racism, or having their children, if the children do speak the Creole, being overrepresented in ESL classrooms. So there are all these things that kind of come into play that would make transmission rather difficult without the proper education and conversation happening around it.
Yeah, that is like very interesting, because it's true with a lot of immigrant populations that come in that are worried that if they keep their culture and their language in the house, then their kids will carry it forward and they won't really get acclimatized to the new setting they're in and exploit all of the benefits that they could from moving here.
Which is not necessarily supported in research in terms of including the home language, and learning your home language. It actually does have benefits, as we see in second language acquisition. But rightfully so, when you do think of the actual experience of many immigrants of discrimination, you do understand in some extent the fears around it.
Yeah. Before we go into anything else, you've talked about like Creole languages, and so could you just explain what Creole means?
Absolutely. That's a good question. So Creole languages, generally speaking, they are contact languages, and they're spoken all over the world, actually, but largely it's influenced by, in the Caribbean specifically, it does come out of the harsh realities of the transatlantic slave trade. And what you find, you have two groups of people who need to communicate but do not share a common language, and that's how Creoles tend to be born. And when this new creation is sustained over time and spoken by new generations, it becomes a Creole language. So essentially, what it is, in the case of Jamaican Creole or other Anglophone Caribbean Creoles, it is a combination of a lexifier language, and what that is the language that's providing the bulk of the vocabulary, the lexicon of the language. And in the case of English Creoles, that's English. And then it's made up also of a substrate based, and this part carries the grammar and the phonology largely of the language. And in the case of Creoles, these are largely the African languages that come together. And so really what it is the languages of power being the vocabulary most often, and the language of the oppressed being contributing the underlying structure of the language. And so it makes it a bit interesting in discussions of language acquisition, because in Canada, it's not like when we talk about heritage languages, we're often talking about, say, Tagalog and English or something like that. That's a bit more clear cut. But here we have the Creole looking like it's English, which is why it's often perceived as broken, because the vocabulary makes it look, oh, it's the same thing, sort of. But really, what distinguishes it is that the grammar, the structure, the syntax is quite different. Mm-hmm. So that's a general thing. Contact language between one language providing the vocab, one language or group of languages largely providing the grammar and the phonology. So the sounds of the language as well.
Yeah, that is really interesting. And it's great that you talk about the transatlantic slave period, because this is a big thing as well when we talk about language and how it's changed, especially English, where a lot of other countries that have been through periods of colonialism and slavery in their past do have quote unquote broken forms of English, where they've taken in the language of their colonizers and are using them in their normal term. So how do communities then foster support for community-based approaches to learning the language, considering the heritage that and the culture and the history that's come behind what it is today?
Yeah, it's really interesting, actually. And I think, yeah, with colonialism, what it is really, the language of colonialism is English in this context. And what we're talking about then is the learning of the Creole, which is something really born, localized out of the Caribbean or out of Australia, where it's also spoken in different ways, or many other countries. And so how I see it is that it's almost that using social and cultural transmission puts the reins in the hands of the community themselves, where they, for once, get to decide, get to have agency about how their languages are transmitted. And this was one of the findings in the study that I wasn't necessarily expecting, that when asked about how should the language be shared, should it be shared, should other people learn it, a lot of the participants felt that yes, absolutely, people in Toronto who really want to be part of the culture should go ahead and learn it. But they drew a line where for people with ethnic heritage or Jamaican or Caribbean heritage, those people, according to the participants, should learn it through social and community routes, while the other people with no heritage connection, sure, you can learn it, but you should learn it through more formal ways. So in a sense, it's almost that they still get to guard their culture and their heritage and have a say in how their language is transmitted. And I think that it doesn't fix the effects of colonialism, but I think it does put the power in the hands of the community that always got the lower end of the stick, so to speak.
Okay. Then why couldn't the education, considering the heritage as well, be taught in these formal methods of learning the language?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is definitely for languages like Creoles that are so tied to culture. I think all languages really are deeply tied to culture. It is almost impossible to separate the culture and the heritage from it. And so, for example, in Toronto, where we see Jamaican Creole having such a prominent role, largely influenced by people like Drake, to be honest, in Toronto, where you travel on the subway, you travel on the bus, and you hear students who have no ties to Jamaica, clearly, speaking this language. And I think it is largely culture-based, that this type of learning has to do with listening to the music, engaging with people in the community. So I think it still would be very tied to culture. It's more of the context, I think. So the content would essentially be the same, but you wouldn't be learning it as what we would classify in second language acquisition as a second language learner. For those people with no connection, I think the community would rather they learn it through whichever formal route. And that may, for them, they did believe it does include the culture largely, or traveling to the country. But for those with heritage connections, they felt directly through community and social relationships.
So for those with heritage roots then,
Yeah.
do the social connections that build their appreciation and education of the language, does it always have to just be through family, or has there been like systematic ways of providing it similar to that of formal education but not necessarily formal?
Yeah. So for languages like Creoles, that's exactly the problem. There is no systematic provision, largely speaking, except in recent years there have been York University has taught a Jamaican Creole course, and I have spoken to the professor at the time who was teaching it, and he actually felt that his students weren't those with heritage connections. They were those who just had a deep interest in the culture. So in a sense, the systematic attempts have really appealed to those without heritage connections. For those with heritage connections, I find, yes, largely family. And the other thing that came up was through community and cultural organizations. There are quite a few of those for Caribbean countries in Toronto, Jamaica probably having the most. But one of the other avenues that is probably understudied, but very significant for Caribbean cultures, especially Jamaica, which is said to have the most churches per square mile in the world. The church is a major source of transmission of the language, the Jamaican church within the city, which there are many. And this is not unique necessarily to the Jamaican community. It's quite common among, say, for Korean heritage language transmission to be done through faith-based programs. And so in the same way, I think that is probably the biggest driver of transmission or at least one of the biggest outside of the family. I would say the church and community centers or organizations would be the next biggest drivers of transmission of the language and culture.
And that's obviously fair, where you just have more opportunities to be part of your community and learn this, especially through different means that may not just be within your household.
Yeah.
And then, to what extent do you consider knowing one's heritage language to be essential to having a greater appreciation for understanding your heritage and the history that's come behind where your family and your community has come so far?
Yeah. My thinking has changed a little bit on this. So essentially, I do think knowing your heritage language and using that to access your culture is huge. It's invaluable. And I think one of the biggest inroads into a culture is through their language. So I think it's very important, but I think having done this study, so going in, I would say absolutely essential, but I think having done this study and really sitting down and talking with a lot of immigrants in Toronto, I kind of got a more nuanced approach that yes, it's important, but how that looks, how that knowing your heritage language looks will differ according to from individual to individual, and that's fine. And that there's still ways that you can access the community. So what we find is that for some, especially in immigrant context, lots of research, particularly from Professor Suresh Kanagaraja, who did a lot of work on the Sri Lankan community, found that it just language knowledge doesn't necessarily look the same way as it does on the homeland.
Yeah.
And so they found that many Tamil speakers or heritage language speakers would use bits and pieces of the language in these cities. But they felt that that was how they showed their proficiency. So it might not look like what we would call proficient in, say, Sri Lanka, but in this, it allowed them to kind of construct their own identity and in that way access their culture in different ways while navigating and negotiating their immigrant identity in these cities as well. So I think, yes, important, but what that looks like, what your proficiency looks like, I think there's lots of wiggle room there.
Yeah, that's definitely really cool to talk about the various ways that future generations could be learning their language and their heritage and not forgetting all of the history that's come behind where their families and communities stand now.
Yeah.
To move to another thing that you had mentioned, which was about the inclusion of Creoles in language education, not quite depriving students from attaining the greater socioeconomic advantages that you had mentioned that research showed was the case, rather than the belief that it hurts their opportunities when they learn their mother tongue. Could you talk more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's definitely the prevailing view of Creole languages, especially. It is one of the most fiercely debated, contested ideas of whether the Creole has a place in any form of education whatsoever. And largely, this belief or this debate sits on this fear that including the Creole in education will put students at a disadvantage. It will, in the case of Jamaica, prevent you from learning English, which in turn is the language that gives you greater upward mobility or access to jobs, and that kind of thing. So that's kind of the prevailing view that is there. Why there is always this debate. Whether that's founded on research, that's a whole other question. Researchers at the University of the West Indies have carried out research where they did a pilot to see if teaching Jamaican Creole alongside English, with a special emphasis on contrasting the languages, because that's quite an issue with Creoles where often speakers don't really see the boundaries between the language. So you may think you're speaking pure, let's say pure standard English, when actually the structural basis of what you're saying is using the Creole. And so they did a pilot project for that, and they did see improvements in both knowing the language and being able to contrast it, and it didn't cause any harm to the learning of English. And so I think that's one of the biggest myths to debunk, that including the language in education generally helps. That is the general trend in second language acquisition research, that bringing in the home language helps you to develop the second language as well. And in the case of Creoles, where we do need to have some more explicit focus on teasing the languages apart, essentially, I think it would only help. But as I said, it's a very emotionally charged discussion, which is largely based on misunderstandings of program goals. So people might think once you bring in the Creole, you're trying to not teach English or French or whatever it is and only teach. So I think a lot of it is quite emotionally charged. But the research does suggest that it can only benefit students.
And based on that, I'm curious, has there ever been research, or have you seen how it affects communities if people in their community or future generation, their kids and grandkids, aren't learning their language or what they've spoken at home or in the community generally?
It's a wide area of research. I haven't seen in the Caribbean context, but a lot of research on this comes, especially with Creoles, comes out of the UK with Seba, where he found that the Jamaican community in particular was the one language, because of this perception of it as not being fit for schooling or being non-standard, so to speak, that they found that it was the easiest language to transmit that was the one community that had no issue transmitting their languages across generations. And so there's that. But of course, there are the obvious issues of intergenerational communication that break down when we're not maintaining these heritage languages. And so that being one of the biggest issues. But I would be really interested to see research that explored the impact of that. But I think a lot of it has focused on the impact it has on cultural transmission.
Yeah, that's really cool. And talking especially in the context of JamC with English being its lexifier, what makes putting in formal education mechanisms for it difficult rather than teaching a language that has a distinct lexifier from English?
Yeah. It's complex, I would say. I think some people disagree, but it is quite complex because we have so many variables at work here. So putting the language attitudes and the fears aside, it is that the relationship between Creoles and their lexifier languages, whichever European that language that is, maybe French, Spanish, whatever it is quite unique compared to the general relationship we see in other second language learning situations like Spanish and English, French and English, or even Mandarin and French or English, whatever it is. Those are they're quite clear cut. And so with Creoles, it's not, the lines are a bit blurred, right? Because we have the vocabulary, that's the very obvious bit of it. The vocabulary is largely around 90% of Jamaican Creole vocabulary is taken from English. And so on the surface level, linguistically speaking, it looks like English. But then when you're applying the grammatical structure that belongs to a Creole, it just looks like incorrect English. And I think that's one of the things that makes it a bit challenging, that we would need to develop really context-sensitive and localized approaches to teaching in this context, which is what my research is about, that we do need to develop ways, not borrowing necessarily everything from the global north, but developing ways to address this really unique situation. A lot of that, the research has shown the need for linguistic or language awareness or contrastive analysis of the languages. So highlighting this is how we say this or write this in the Creole, this is how we say it in English or French or whatever it is, to highlight these differences for students. So that's one thing. So we would need to develop programs because there are different ones implemented, but we haven't had a lot of consensus. So that's one thing. The other thing is the need for teacher training, which in another research study that I did on writing development among primary school children, I interviewed a lot of teachers, and what we found was that despite knowing the challenges, all the teachers commented that they were trained in Jamaica and they were trained for a monolingual classroom. So they're trained for a classroom where everyone speaks English, even though that is not the reality at all in these classrooms. And so another issue that complicates it is the need for suitable teacher training, because teachers, like many of the students, do mix and mesh between these languages, which is absolutely great. But they would need specific training for how do we kind of contrast these? How do we use them together or apart? So I think those are a lot of the issues that we do need to develop localized programs, and we do need to train the teachers accordingly. Until we do that, we'll always be going in circles.
Yeah, that is really interesting. Because I'd always when I was also reading your paper, I always thought of it from the student perspective, but it's really interesting that you talk about the educator's perspective as well from that.
Yeah, because it's, in a sense, I did feel for them. I think when I went into the research, I always thought of it as a student and thought the teacher should just do a better job or that kind of thing. And I think now, as a professor, but also talking to them, you realize that, well, what are we supposed to do? You haven't trained us for this, in a sense. And then it's also within context where standard language ideology, where we privilege the standard, so to speak. It's very hard if we just expect teachers to magically kind of remove themselves from society and language attitudes as if they're immune, and also know how to figure out how to support all these learners.
Yeah, that is really cool. As well as that, during your research, were you able to see what possible long-term effects would be of loss of heritage languages, not specifically to JamC, but also in general, and whether it would, like, what kind of problem it would be if people just actually talked English.
Oh my gosh. That would be really sad. I think generally what we see, the long-term loss, a lot of language is inseparable from culture. And so when we don't transmit languages, we're not transmitting a lot of those cultural artifacts. In the Caribbean is largely made up of oral societies, where a lot of emphasis is on the oral rather than having a written language culture. So poetry, storytelling, that's a very strong culture where older generations tell stories, tell Anansi stories and these cultural artifacts to children. And so it's transmitted orally. And so what you find is that there's this disconnect then if we kind of neglect our heritage languages. And as I said, what the proficiency should be or look like is completely variable and non-prescriptive. But I think we do need to find ways, not just on the part of the learners, but on the part of the government to continue to support heritage language education, and not just for powerful languages like Spanish and French, but for other languages. When you think of it, Jamaica is one of the largest immigrant nations in all of Canada, and 70% of them live in Toronto, which means, and it's one of the most commonly spoken mother tongues of the Black population in all of Canada. And so when we neglect these populations, you are leaving out a huge number. And so a lot of it is to kind of widen our definition of what's a heritage language and what's a heritage language learner. And until we do that, then it will be difficult for us to make space if we're just thinking very black and white, that a heritage language looks like Korean or say Mandarin or Spanish, rather than languages that may not be standardized, but there are different ways to approach learning. So I think that would be the biggest thing.
Yeah, of course. So then do you consider knowing one's heritage language essential to their appreciation of understanding their heritage?
I think it's very important. Whether it's essential, I can't say. I would lean to yes, but I think there are other ways to access your heritage. And for different reasons, people may not learn their heritage languages. But I think it's a big piece. It's a big inroad, as I said earlier, to accessing your culture and understanding kind of your history and your community's history. But definitely probably not the only way. Yeah.
So you'd say there could be a way for education of the heritage languages and the heritage to be done distinctly rather than having to be done together to fully appreciate both?
I would say for a full appreciation, you kind of need to marry both things together. And this will vary from language to language. For some languages, especially the languages of power that are spoken in such different contexts that they mean many different things to different people that might look different, say French, English, but definitely for languages like creoles and non-standardized ones that are very tied to cultural histories, I cannot imagine how you would teach, as a Jamaican native myself, I cannot imagine how you would teach it separate from the culture, the music, the food, the people. So I think it goes hand in hand. A lot of Jamaican culture is very tied to the language, the expressions, the slangs, the music. So I think it would have to go hand in hand for you to get a full appreciation of, oh, this is my culture, this is my history.
Well, you talked about the case of York University and like teaching Jamaican Creole. Even during formal education methods and pathways, is it always a trend to also get in parts of like the culture in terms of the food and people? So trying to get the students to go out and experience the like festivals that might be around it, or go to specific restaurants so you can actually like see and like hear the people talk to fully appreciate and get an overall experience of what it would be like if to know the language.
I think for languages like Jamaican, that would be an excellent approach. That's a more communicative, socially driven approach. Is it the case across all languages? Not necessarily. I think language teaching is a massive industry, and people come to language learning with such different motivations. So I teach a course on second language learning, and I think the students' favorite week is when we talk about motivation in learning a language? Why do you decide to learn a language? What makes people keep learning a language? And you find that motivation is one of the biggest drivers for how people choose to learn a language. And so depending on your goal, you may not be interested at all in, say, going to restaurants, learning the culture. Say I want to, if I had maybe Chinese culture, but I want to learn Mandarin, maybe because I want to move to China and I want to pursue some studies or I want to get a job, then I would be likely very driven by not necessarily a communicative or social approach, focusing on culture and eating the food, but more so I want to be able to write or speak or present or that kind of thing. Rather than when people have very integrative motivations, they want to integrate with the culture, they want to understand their history. That's where you find them leaning definitely more to that type of engagement with culture. And that is a very strong driver. The research suggests that integrative approaches or integrative motivations of wanting to be a part of something are a strong driver that also not just drives you to learn the language, but makes you continue to learn and maintain the language.
Yeah, that is really cool. Based on that, then, are there any benefits that you'd say to people from Jamaican heritage when those not from the heritage are learning JamC?
So in this study, when I asked them about this, people were very excited by the fact that non-heritage speakers wanted to learn their language. And I think that was particularly heartening for them, coming from a language that has been more seen as stigmatized. And so I think for them, especially in a city like Toronto, to know that your language is valued and your culture has some cultural capital was really exciting for them. And so they absolutely loved that, although they did feel that those people should learn it through formal routes. But they were really happy for that. Because you could look at it another way, that maybe it would be seen as appropriation or that kind of concern, but that was not what I found in the research. People weren't, and I think that kind of goes towards the fact that a lot of them reported that they felt that there's some parts of the language that you can't learn anyway if you're not a heritage speaker. So I think they felt that then fine, we will still own and have agency in our language, but they were very happy kind of for their language to be proliferated in the city.
Yeah, and your paper talks about some of the things that the respondents from your studies were saying about what non-heritage speakers would not be able to get out of it.
Yeah.
Including like the accent or flavor, as one of your respondents said.
Flavor, as they put
it.
They felt that you could, a lot of them said things like you can teach the grammar and the vocabulary, but you can't teach them the flavor. And that's where culture and language become so intertwined that I know exactly what they're saying, that to speak Jamaican is also a way of just being. Like the Jamaican Creole, it's, if you have really watched Jamaicans interact, it's a whole thing that your entire body is involved in this situation. And so for them, that was the aspect that you couldn't teach. I think someone gave the example that you could teach them exactly how to say wagwan, but they wouldn't say it with the feeling, with the emotion that you need to say it with. So yeah, they felt there were some things, but largely they felt it could be taught, just not certain flavor aspects.
Okay. Very interesting. And now your research also focused like mainly about in Toronto and heritage language education in Toronto, especially for JamC. So what would you say the benefits to Toronto as a city is for it to like keep its diversity in voices and its different languages, and hope to ensure that future generations do learn the languages of their foremothers?
Yeah. I think that's what makes Toronto quite special. I mean, nowhere near perfect in all the heritage language provisions as we've seen in the research, but I think that's what makes Toronto special, this fostering of different languages, that you can walk along the street and hear so many different languages. And so I think that is very important to the continued celebration of diversity in this city, and to making Toronto truly what it is, not just in terms of lip service that we're so diverse, but really honoring that with our resources and funding to honor heritage language education, because it doesn't hurt development of English or anything. And I think that's a really strong message to send considering that so many immigrants fear that my child won't integrate, my child won't learn the language. And so I think really promoting that would say a lot to the people that we invite into this country and in this city.
Yeah, it definitely does. You have mentioned again that you were a Caribbean native. So how did your own experiences make you approach this topic?
Yeah, that's a good question. So yes, I grew up in the Caribbean. I studied at the University of Toronto as an undergraduate, an international student. And so I only moved here when I was 18, maybe 19. And so I spent the good part of my life in Jamaica. And so I lived this narrative of the Creole being more stigmatized. I went to an all-girls boarding school where we weren't even allowed. It was very discouraged. You were discouraged from speaking the Creole. And it was just seen as better to speak English. And so this is a very real narrative for me. And to come and do this research was a bit interesting, especially being someone who grew up speaking predominantly English, standard Jamaican English. And so it was a bit interesting. And so coming into the research, I did expect that narrative. I expected them to say that we don't want to learn it because it won't give us upward mobility. I expected a lot, but I think what I didn't anticipate was this whole idea of the language taking on this new form, this new life or identity in this immigrant context. That what really spurred this research was me sitting on the subway one day and hearing a bunch of high school boys speaking a language that sounded familiar but not familiar to me. And it was realizing that in the context of Toronto, Jamaican Creole is taking on a new life. It's becoming a more multicultural vernacular spoken by people who have no connection, absolutely none, to the Caribbean. And so I think that was an interesting finding for me, that what we find is it's actually following what we see in the UK years prior, where it's becoming what they call now in the UK multicultural English or something like that. I forget the exact name, but it's largely based on Jamaican Creole that has evolved and is now spoken by a large cross-section. And I think Toronto is following a very similar pattern. So I found that interesting. I found the idea that Jamaicans are very happy for others to learn their language, informal, but not through familial transmission. That was another thing that I didn't expect. So I think, all in all, I think the things I didn't expect were the positive, more promising things that shows that it is worthwhile to have these discussions, to kind of look at non-standardized languages. Because a big question is often, so what's the point then? But these findings show that there's a huge point in doing this, that it affects a huge cross-section of our city, and they do want their language to be transmitted. But it's just a bit more nuanced than conversations that kind of look at things in black and white ways, like heritage maintenance, heritage loss. So it's just a bit more complex.
I do find it really interesting that you mentioned that even not just like in Toronto, but even back home in Jamaica, that you were being forced to just learn English and not what we considered like the local language, which is definitely like really interesting. And then you come into your research and you're like, oh, actually, if I learned it, like it wouldn't have negatively affected me.
Yeah, so it's always, it makes you reflect a lot when you do this kind of research, because these are the values that I grew up with, and this is what I did believe was right. And then coming to it from this other side of the story now is always very interesting and requires a lot of reflection at all times.
Yeah, that's really cool. And it's great to hear like your view as well, like coming into it with some background on the topic and then learning all of this. But based on that, do you have anything else to add before we close off?
I think I just would throw it back to you to close off, and just ask you what's your experience in your community in Toronto of heritage language transmission and kind of how you see things.
Yeah. So I didn't grow up in Toronto either.
Okay.
I've just like come here for university.
Oh.
But this was really interesting. So I'm of Indian descent and I'm a Hindu. So I had gone to the temple a couple of days ago for Diwali, and it was really surprising because like I live in downtown Toronto, where well, in like the little bubble like near university, like most people just talk in English. So it doesn't really like feel that Toronto is that multicultural till you're like moving around the city, like going either far east, far west, up north, etc. but we'd gone to the temple like that was closer in Etobicoke, and it was like
Yes.
all these people were talking Gujarati, which is like my mother tongue. And it was like,
Mm-hmm.
this is so surprising. But it is like really cool that I felt that a lot of the kids who are like my age or younger were speaking back in English, but they still
Yes.
understood their parents when they were talking in Gujarati,
Yes.
which was like a big shock, but also like really cool because it felt like, oh, like I'm back home and like people are just like doing this.
I'm sure.
So
Yeah.
and like seeing it at this scale was kind of cool.
Yeah. And I think that's a good way to wrap. Just the joy is the biggest thing, that the joy that people report when they hear their own language in this city. It's almost like, oh, right. It's like something that connects right to their soul when you hear your own language, when you've been away from home. And so I think for that alone, we should continue to foster these. I think anytime in my class there's any mention of students' home language or someone say something in Mandarin, for example, the smiles on their faces that they don't realize when you hear your own language. And I think for that reason, we should continue in the fight to maintain heritage languages.
Yeah, that is really cool. Great. Thanks so much, Shawna. And that concludes our episode of Curious Campus with Professor Shawna. If anything you heard today interests you, definitely look into her paper, Beyond Sea, Sun, and Fun, exploring the viability of Jamaican Creole heritage language education in Toronto. Stay tuned to Curious Campus.